Goldberg, and I'm a PhD student in the History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art program here at MIT. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the final lecture of this semester in the HEC Forum series, which my colleague Chelsea Spencer and I are chairing this term. HEC Forum provides an opportunity for the program's doctoral students to bring to campus scholars whose work we find compelling and challenging. These are scholars who are shaping the field, instigating critical conversations, whose work we discover in our courses and in our own research. The lecture series creates the space and time for conversation within our department while also aiming to engage the broader intellectual communities in Boston and Cambridge. We would like to extend a special thank you to the Lippstadt-Stieber Fund for generously sponsoring this talk and for encouraging such discussions at HTC. I am pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Haroon Küçük. A historian of early modern science and technology, Professor Küçük is assistant professor in the Department of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches such courses as the rifle and the compass, science, technology, and early modern warfare, in an effort to abrogate teleological histories of science in favor of a deep history of technoscience that analyzes overlapping histories of non-human actors, like the rifle and compass, but also specie and the printing press. This method of history, which he calls a new materialist historiography of early modern science, and which I'm sure we will hear about more about tonight, promises to be of relevance to many projects here in HTC. In particular, Professor Küçük focuses on temporal and monetary underpinnings of scientific activity in order to do away with such terms as culture, practice, modernity, conservatism, innovation, and civilization, terms that have been used to periodize science between a flourishing scientific revolution and a science of decline. Professor Küçük is the author of several book chapters and journal articles that appear in the Journal of Early Modern History and the Journal of Ottoman Studies, among other publications. He has several, and I must say very exciting, ongoing projects, including a book-length essay that continues his reevaluation of terminology. In this text, he outlines temporal regimes of science by reframing concepts such as theory, scientific labor, and useful knowledge by referring to alternative durations such as generations, grant cycles, and career stages. In addition to a source book for Ottoman science between 1400 and 1700 and an investigation of the almanac genre, Professor Küçük is part of a research team supported by the European Research Council, exploring notions of the natural and supernatural in the Ottoman Empire. A web portal will be published along with a monograph and a peer-reviewed journal, so we all have much to look forward to in the realm of jinns, magic, and marvelous geographies. Tonight we'll hear about another kind of magic, a form of magic familiar to all of us, scholarly publication. It's true. We're here to learn about, but also to celebrate the publication of Professor Küçük's first monograph, Science Without Leisure, Practical Naturalism in Istanbul, 1660 to 1732. In it, Professor Küçük examines how, although for roughly a century, Istanbul produced no texts dealing with the classical sciences of astronomy, theoretical medicine, and natural medicine, in a period of hyperinflation that all but decimated the living conditions of the professorate, Istanbul experienced its most prolific century in almanacs, drug recipes, and instrument manuals. This is a fascinating history with contemporary resonance. As Professor Küçük proposed in his abstract for this talk, does science need to be useful? Are productivity and innovation good goals for academics? Do academics need to be paid? Well, we might leave that one aside. Yeah. But in all seriousness, these are questions of great importance to all of us, questions which I am sure will stimulate lively discussion. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Haroon Küçük.
Thank you for that great introduction, and thanks to Roxanne and Chelsea for inviting me here. This is a very interesting venue for me, and I'm deeply honored just to be speaking to like such a great audience. I remember back in 2015, I gave a talk about hypochondria in York Academy of Medicine. And secretly, I was hoping that Woody Allen would show up. But actually, only 3 retired psychologists showed up. So, I'm just really appreciative that, you came out to listen to me in this, in this hour of the day where you'd, much rather be at home. And I was also, recently lecturing about what was happening in the Netherlands in the 17th century, and one thing that pops up is there are public anatomical theaters, and people go to observe anatomy there. And I asked my students what kind of person goes to the anatomical theater for entertainment, which was all the more puzzling for them because Philadelphia has many great public science institutions like the Franklin Institute, and none of them had even been there. So it was. This is my way of saying, thank you for coming out. Science Without Leisure. I was hoping to bring the physical item with me. I am sorry, I do not have the physical item just yet. It is at the printers, and its physical appearance is imminent. With this hideous cover. So that's going to be the cover of my book. It looks like, 1001 Nights or something like that with it's a little I don't know what to call it. It's definitely Orientalist, and not particularly tastefully done, right? With the silly font and blowed up colors and things like that. But my editor assured me that given the kind of book this is the cover it needs, and I'm hoping you won't judge the book by its cover. Okay, so Science Without Leisure. So I should start by talking about leisure. I'm mainly drawing on Bourdieu's work when I talk about leisure, but being a historian, of course, I'm not allowed to just plunk in someone like Bourdieu and just expect things to work themselves out. So it's quite subdued what I do with Bourdieu's notion of leisure. But leisure is, above all things, it's a perception of time and disposition towards the world. And some of you may know, if you have been reading as much Bourdieu as I have, or even not as much. Bourdieu is really taking issue with something like people at the university failing to understand what's happening on the ground, right? So it's the inaccessibility of the social realm to social scientists precisely because they're observing it at a distance. So this was, I would say, this led me to think about things. And it led me, among other things, to think about Aristotle. Because Aristotle is the leisure guy. Nicomachean ethics, by and large, is about the relationship between science and leisure. It is about, basically distancing yourself. And this is still with us, I would say. So, for Aristotle, something like physics, it starts with the senses. It starts with what is better known to us, and then moves to rational things, to causes and first principles that are better known by their very own nature, right? So things that are, by their constitution, more knowable come after you have been able to transcend the senses. And this notion of science has been with us. In fact, I would say it's still what gives science its distinctive quality. So, one way to think about it is Max Planck is a very good example, because so Max Planck supposedly, somebody went to him, they were making light bulbs, and they said, I just need to make a better, more efficient light bulb. And Max Planck came up with black body radiation. And of course, as a light bulb maker, you're what am I supposed to do with that? Similarly, when you think about someone like Newton, right, very sort of canonical figure, and there's a debate about, was Newton actually doing something useful? And the thing is, you go to Newton with all these navigational problems, with these cannon shooting problems, so on and so forth, and he gives you a Latin book on celestial mechanics and leaves it for you to figure it out. This kind of distancing, right? So it's getting as far away from nature without actually leaving the room is the distinctive quality of physics. And as far as I can tell, it has been that way since Aristotle's time. So there is something quite deeply historical about something like physics, because it requires you to distance yourself, again, without leaving the room, because if you leave the room, you become an ascetic. You need to find nature interesting, but you need to be interested in it such that you want to evacuate all the sensory content, and you simply want to understand the wireframe of nature, as it were. And this is, again, an act of distancing that requires you to basically, dissociate yourself from your daily experience of the world. So that's where the leisure bit comes in. It's like Bourdieu plus Aristotle, and I am more or less making the case in the book that you need to think about science in the early modern period in precisely these terms, because when you talk about physics and theoretical astronomy and theoretical medicine or anatomy, you're basically talking about distancing yourself from the sensory realities that are quite overpowering, if not dominating for most of us, right? So I make a distinction between like practical naturalism, which is as you can see, it's the subtitle of the book, and the leisure sciences. So this is kind of my first move, and I guess I spent many, many pages explaining it. So after science, Ottoman practical naturalism. That's like right there, 30 pages of me talking about leisure. And what I also do, like as a manner of introducing the subject matter, is to talk about, well, we talk about like having science, not having science. These people had like made great discoveries, so on and so forth. Well, I mean, what are we really talking about? And there, I talk about, well, how we associate science with theory. And in fact, if you were a historian of science 30, 40 years ago, people would tell you to just focus on theory, because that's where the serious history of science takes place. And no theory, no science continues to be kind of like the way philosophers of science talk about science today. And I talk about it as after science because I'm looking at a period where you could talk about theory in Istanbul, where you could talk about people who were approaching natural things from a distance. And it's not proto-science in that what they are doing practically doesn't really lead to science. It's post-scientific. And this is also kind of the hook for us, because this is the future that we are looking at today. So a lot of you are probably engaged in some kind of discussion with many, many people about like neoliberalism and what it means for the university, et cetera, et cetera. It means what it meant, well, what hyperinflation meant for Istanbul in the 17th century. So that's kind of like how I open the book. And I am quite materialist in my outlook, but there is also some idealism in that. I do believe that a lot of us have the capability to be really idealistic, provided that we have the material circumstances to be idealistic. As in, I actually like to think things that have nothing to do with my daily life. But I can't do that if daily life is just imposing itself on me all the time. So I do believe in. So I'm not a materialist in that we're all like drones of like the structures of production or something like that. But I do believe that the outside world and including economic circumstances play a huge part in what we're able to think and what we're not able to think. And just on this point, I kind of want to give you a rundown of the book. So chapter 1, and this is something that I'll get to later on, gives you a view of Istanbul in the 17th century. And what's distinctive about 17th century Istanbul is that it's not a nice place to live. It's very crowded. It's a huge city. And it's a sick city. There is lots of sickness that's happening in Istanbul. It's a city that's always getting immigrants and always losing people to wars and epidemics. And I like to think about it like a lousy big city, like lousy big cities today. So think of New York. I think Chelsea and Roxanne were like, yeah, that's like kind of like New York. It is kind of like New York, I would say. With the exception being in New York's case, of course, you have like universities that pay their professors really, really well. And afterwards, I give you a statistical distribution of the scientific work that gets done in Istanbul, and I will get to that later. Chapter 2 gives you, well, basically like a blanket history of what was happening in the 15th and the 16th centuries. And the important thing is, in my model of science, the deeply historical model of science, people just don't hit upon science, right? So, I mean, you can talk about any ancient author this way. So Ptolemy, right? Ptolemy is like, much despised, like, oh, like your like Earth-centered view, so on and so forth. Well, Ptolemy is really hard. I mean, not everybody can just sit down and like plow through Ptolemy. Most people actually consciously avoid reading Ptolemy precisely because it's technical and it's difficult. And if you are getting an education in astronomy, Ptolemy is basically what you read last, not what you read first. It's calculus 2, right? That's kind of what it is. So people don't just chance upon Ptolemy. It requires you to take lessons, right? So, and that's the other thing that comes with the book. So this teaching element is tremendously important because you don't know Ptolemy unless somebody teaches you Ptolemy. There is no way to apprentice your way to Ptolemy, just as there is no way for you to apprentice your way to Aristotle or to Galen or to Hippocrates, right? All of these textual bits have to be transmitted generation to generation, usually in some kind of teacher-student relationship, but never a master-apprentice kind of relationship. So Istanbul in the 15th and 16th century is a city where you have teachers, you have great teachers. It's also a city where professors are reasonably well paid, at least, those, late in their careers are reasonably well paid. Then what happens is, and I will get to this again with like a chart later on, is you get hyperinflation. And what does this mean? This means that professors suddenly start getting paid about 1/10 of what they were paid. So imagine this, let's say you're a professor who's making like $100,000. Boom, next day you make $10,000 a year. Like, how would your life change? And if people kept paying you $10,000 for like the next 60 years, how would the profession change? And this is the story that Istanbul has to tell. And what happens in Istanbul is that, of course, this is a story that we are deeply familiar with, even from the late 18th, 19th, 20th century modernization stories about the Ottoman Empire. Science becomes engineering, medicine, and to a certain extent, bureaucracy, right? So you lose the theoretical higher registers completely. The meaning of science changes. Such that there is no science, actually. Even today, I would say in Turkey, it's notoriously just difficult to have a career in science, partly because of like the money situation, but partly because, in a world where like science really has no place and everybody has some understanding of medicine and engineering and bureaucracy, it's really difficult to cultivate science. So Istanbul also tells a story of like, once you lose that register after a long process, it's really hard to build it back up. Like you need basically an intervention. So 1933, there is the university reform in Turkey, and what happens is you need to import academics to get things going again. So Turkey gets a lot of like emigre academics, German-speaking emigre academics, and suddenly you have a university field, and again, it lasts for a while, but because of the salaries, it also tapers down, where, again, if you ask somebody in Turkey in the 1980s, 1990s, so very recent history, when you talk about science, they won't be thinking about, like, biology or, like, physics. They'll, again, be thinking about something like engineering and medicine. So, this is kind of like a long story that's kind of with us. If you're Turkish, I guess this is a story that's with you. And I guess if you're American, it's something that you may be fearing, right? I mean, in these big universities, you have many professional schools, and sometimes you're like, the business school, the medical school, the law school, like, they get all the resources, they get much better paid, and like, there are adjuncts and like, miserable people in the arts and sciences, so on and so forth. So in a way, like, it speaks to those fears as well. And this is what's happening in Istanbul in the 17th century. And then chapters 4, 5, and 6, or actually chapter 4 and 5 mostly, is an attempt to reconstruct fields that are usually called by their traditional name. So the 4th chapter tries to construct the field of astronomy in Istanbul in a way that doesn't include any astronomy, right? Because in Istanbul, nobody gets paid as an astronomer. There is nobody who is a professional astronomer. And in Istanbul, there is not a single text on theoretical astronomy that was written in the 17th century. And you could say, well, even in the first half of the 18th century. So what do you have? You have mostly almanacs. And an almanac, I mean, I don't know how many of you know what an almanac is. I mean, you can get an almanac today. There is the Farmer's Almanac that you can pick up at Barnes & Noble. And in Turkey, we have Saatli Marif Takvimi. If you're Turkish, you're probably aware of this too. And what these are is like, it's partly like a calendar, right? A regular calendar, but they are not pure calendars because they contain all this like extra bits of information. In the Ottoman case, an almanac might include things that might fall under like natural astrology. It will tell you, this is when you eat, this is a good day to eat goat, this is a good day to plant like, seeds of this and that plant, right? It will have information like this. It will have like a list of like fortunate and unfortunate days, etc., etc. So the challenge for me in chapter 4 was to basically rebuild astronomy without reference to any theory of astronomy. And certain like interesting things happen when you try to do this. So you may know that in the 16th, 17th centuries, if you're looking at Europe, the big debate is, well, is Earth the center of the universe or is the sun the center of the universe? Well, in Istanbul, nobody cares what the center is. They are basically trying to figure out whether they can come up with a calendar, a lunisolar calendar that actually works over the long term, right? So, and mostly, this is a story about like moving from a lunar calendar to a solar calendar because that's what happens in 1677. You get a calendar reform, and for the first time, you get what's called an Ottoman calendar as distinct from an Islamic calendar. And, it's the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats are like, setting things up because, the calendar has an importance for the for tax collection and general functioning of the economy. So there is like, the November day, which is where you're supposed to like settle your debts, etc. So you have all of these things that are going into the calendar, and it's fairly important for people to know when to settle their debts and when to pay their taxes, just as it is for us today. So this becomes also the chapter where I discuss, well, this is how bureaucrats become like the masters of time, right? So you don't have, it's not the prayer times, it's not the religious observances, it's not even like any like Ottoman state ritual or anything that determines the fate of the calendar. It's tax collection. And there are like many cases in the 17th and 18th centuries where people miss the Ramadan. Like literally, they think that Ramadan is supposed to start the next day, but no, it's actually today. So they spit out whatever is in their mouths and then they start fasting, but they are not too happy about it. So this calendar does not really care much for the religious part. Also, another interesting thing about Istanbul in the 17th century is that nobody is writing about religious timekeeping, as in like, when the prayers are supposed to be. Which is, again, interesting, and I will turn this into a bigger point later on. I mean, this is something that people in Egypt are still doing. So if you look at, again, what people are writing in the general Islamic world in the 17th century, you'll find a certain like this distribution of genres where most people in Cairo, for example, are writing manuals for determining prayer times. Nobody in Istanbul is doing that. I mean, why is kind of like a mystery to me, but one possibility is that Istanbulites by this point are using sundials, they're using clocks, and generally speaking, maybe they don't need to be so precise about prayer times. That's what chapter 4 does. Chapter 5 looks at medicine, and here I am trying to explain this strange phenomenon where pretty much the entirety of the medical corpus that Istanbul produces, both in the 17th century and in the early part of the 18th century, is about drugs. Istanbul, in Istanbul, medicine means drugs. And, again, this has a great hook for us because, this is what we're afraid, like big pharma and things like that, right? But, this is basically the story of Istanbul. So that's my, chapter 5 is my attempt to rebuild the medical field without calling it medicine, right? So it's the drug recipe that's the real central item of medicine in this century. So how do you write that story without referring to, again, like, familiar tropes such as like Galenic medicine, like, are they still believing in humors? The fact is, they don't seem to believe in anything. They just wonder whether drugs work or don't work. They aren't particularly committed to any theoretical framework, so to speak. So that has been the challenge for chapter 5. And the thing is, of course, not everybody is happy with that, and that's what I turn to in chapter 6. People are complaining, they're like, okay, you know what, I go to see a doctor. I don't know if he's just trying to sell me drugs or if he's like an actual doctor. I go to the astrologer, does this person even know elementary mathematics, right? There are like, people who are like alchemists who actually do like, productive work. They deal with like gems, metals, and so on and so forth. But you never know if that person is trying to dupe you, right? Is that gold? Like, is that real gold, or are you just counterfeiting? Right? These issues, like, these issues of like basic technical competence that, again, largely come with teacher-student relationships, when they go missing, they do, make some people's ears perk up. And that's what happens in the early 18th century. So the early 18th century becomes a reaction, and a rather strong reaction to what happens in Istanbul in the 17th century. And then I talk about, basically, well, when you have people who are complaining about the marketplace, what options are there intellectually speaking? And again, here I was very careful in chapters 7 and 8 not to read things into this period. So I'm not talking about like theoretical discussions, etc. I'm basically trying to understand how mostly these like engineer or physician or like astronomer types try to respond to this challenge, right? How do they prove, or how do they make the case for like, their basic technical competence to a more tasteful audience? So that's the basic outline of the book. And now on to what this book does and says. So I would situate this book in several literatures, one of them being the emerging global historiography of science. And there are many books, many excellent books actually, that came out in recent years that showed me something quite interesting, and this has to do with basically cultural history. So, the way we specialize now, right, we are post like area studies period in our discipline, supposedly, and we all do cultural history, and we do cultural history with an emphasis on the cultural specificity of each place. But the strange thing is, of course, when you read these literatures produced by people who are studying the cultural specificity of different locations, and this is, an excellent book that came out recently that deals with the Caribbean, and there are books like, equally excellent that deal with like Japan, that deal with China, etc., etc. And the fact is, they all sound so similar to what's happening in Istanbul. As in, it seems like, what we take to be science, if we take science to be theory, is actually very rare. And again, thinking about scholarship that's produced on Europe, you also find that people who have these theoretical concerns are very rare. So it becomes so in a manner of speaking, Istanbul transcends its like specific locality. It becomes a proxy for the global baseline. So if nobody does anything, if nobody is paying anybody to do anything intellectually sophisticated, if nobody is paying any teachers, etc., the picture that you get pretty much everywhere is kind of like this. And this is a distribution of the genres in Istanbul. I made a sort of special point of like putting zeros here because they are in fact zeros. But what these tell us are just a number of things. So first of all, there is like physics and kelam. Like I put those two together because they usually go together in this period in Islamic history. Istanbul is not interested in physics. Istanbul is not interested in kelam. Nobody is writing about these things. So Istanbul, in a manner of speaking, is a post-cosmological, post-doctrinal kind of place, right? They don't have any cosmological beliefs, it looks like, and they also don't have any doctrine. So being Muslim means like going to the mosque and praying and fasting when you're supposed to fast, eating when you're supposed to eat, and not really worrying about all these, again, doctrinal questions. Well, is the Earth center of the universe or something like that, right? You don't care about these things if you live in Istanbul in this period. Same thing goes with anatomy. There is nobody who is writing about anatomy in Istanbul. And mind you, anatomy is, again, one of those things that marks like the long-term trajectory of science for many of us. So you may know about like Andreas Vesalius on the fabric of the human body, right? Very famous work. Well, people in Istanbul are not interested in that at all. Nobody is writing about it, and it seems nobody is thinking about it either in the 17th century. Theoretical astronomy. Zilch, nothing. And the one theoretical astronomer, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, that lives and dies in the early 18th century is this guy called Halil Faiz, and he takes his own life because he's so depressed about what he's doing. Ephemerides. Ephemerides is, these are basically star tables, and they usually indicate whether you're doing any sort of like investment or long-term investment in astronomical observation. Are you keeping tables? Well, Istanbul is not keeping tables, right? So there is zero investment in long-term observation of the heavens, which again, like, just going back to this like previous point, this is how things are for most people around the world, right? Very few people, if any, are doing things that fall under these genres. And it seems to me that a lot of the history of science is written based on these very rarely presented genres. And what do you get in Istanbul? Well, you get works that deal with gems and metals, with people who are actually working with gems and metals. So you don't have like these people who are just observing gems and metals from a distance and commenting on them. These are people who are actually trying to do things. So there is, the one example is Hasan Ağa. He, at some point in his career, he gets assigned to northern or Upper Egypt, not northern Egypt. Upper Egypt is South Egypt, so I get that confused sometimes, where there used to be emerald mines. And he gets assigned there, and he is trying to dig out some emerald. But nobody's telling him how to do that. So he becomes the most prolific author, alchemical author of the 17th century. He writes 14 treatises on the subject. But this is the kind of person that's writing the books, right? This is people who are actually trying to do things. Drugs, right? So Istanbul is by far the most prolific place, definitely in the Islamic world, but also possibly in the world, when it comes to the drug genre. Many people are writing, translating, retranslating things that have to do with drug recipes. And under drugs, I group several things. So polyglot herbal dictionaries, materia medica texts, pharmacopoeias, these all fall under drugs. There is one text on veterinary medicine, two texts on the plague, one on scurvy and one on hygiene. And the hygiene bit is really funny because it's written by a poet who is complaining precisely how people don't care about preventative medicine anymore, that everybody is kind of like into drugs, so they don't worry about things, the main item in preventative medicine, which is like hygiene. You have instrument manuals. Most of these instrument manuals have to do with astronomical instruments. So while people aren't doing any theory or like long-term observations, it's easy to tell that a lot of people are doing at least some casual or daily observations of the heavens, possibly for these calendrical purposes. So take that for what it's worth. And almanacs, this is like as far as the chart would go in the software that I use, but we just have hundreds of almanacs from Istanbul. So that's also a very well represented genre. And again, I'd like to remind you that no matter where you go, this is going to be largely the distribution, and it will just be very exceptional if you find any texts that are written in these genres that are zero in Istanbul. And the question is, well, why is that, right? So why isn't there any physics? Why isn't there any anatomy? Why isn't there any theoretical astronomy? Why aren't there any ephemerides? And mind you, right, this is the stuff of Islamic science also. So if you go to any place and get a one lecture, a whole course on the history of Islamic science, it will be chock full of these things. It's going to give you lots of kalam. It's going to tell you, well, Aristotle believed that there were like 4 elements, but the kalam, which is like philosophical theology, had this like atomistic setup. You're going to hear about like anatomy. Maybe you'll hear about like Ibn al-Nafis or something like that. Theoretical astronomy is just like, it's such a huge industry. I would say this is the bulk of like people who work on Islamic science today work on Islamic astronomy, which is mostly theory and ephemerides, right? So why aren't Istanbulites doing any of this stuff? And I might have an answer that's, materialistic. So this is a chart showing nominal wages of professors against real prices. And this is a logarithmic scale, so there is tremendous impoverishment going on. Now, again, we try to explain why science in Istanbul looks the way it does by reference to specifically cultural things. Whereas I don't think there is anything specifically cultural. We talk about conservatism, Sharia-mindedness, and things like that. And this chart is dude, you aren't paying anybody for any teaching whatsoever. Why would you expect to find anything that's not directly lucrative? So just to put some context into the numbers. So actually, Istanbul was a place that used to pay its professors well in the 15th and the 16th century. In fact, Istanbul, which had 0 educational institutions in 1453, attract people to teach there by paying them good money. And by paying them good money, I mean money that would not be surprising to any professor today. What I did in the book was I looked at flour prices, because bread comes in different sizes and so on and so forth. But I looked at flour prices. And roughly speaking, in Istanbul, if you're teaching in the second half of the 15th century, your purchasing power is, and for flour prices, I use the Walmart website today, so bear with me. These aren't rigorous calculations. My only goal is to give you a sense of the orders of magnitude of things. But the thing is, you made $60,000, $70,000 in today's money if you were a professor in Istanbul at the end of the 15th century. Then, 1585 or so, you have this thing called the Great Debasement. That's when prices really go up. And by the end of the 17th century, if you're a professor, the greatest, the most amount of money you can make in a year is about $5,000. So basically, it's not a living wage profession. Again, this has to do with what we're facing right now in the United States. We think it's neoliberalism. It's, I would say, largely the problem is, well, are you paying people to pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake? And the answer is, generally speaking, no. We pay very few people to pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake. That's going on in Istanbul. So that's kind of what explains the general outlay, the outline of the scientific genres. And there is one example that usually pops up if you're studying science in Istanbul, etc. you talk about this guy called Ali Kushci, who is, of course, like, who comes to Istanbul very late in his life. He's, I think, 67 or so when he comes to Istanbul, and he doesn't live very long. But, we count him among, like, the Ottomans, like, because he's got this, like, Turkish-sounding name, and he actually does some stuff in Istanbul. Well, he gets paid like football coach money. He gets paid around, like, 300K. Right? So that's, like, how Ali Kushci is, like, becomes Ali Kushcis. And, well, when you look at the professors in the 17th century, they are like several classes below someone like Ali Kushci from an economic perspective. And again, like, examples from Europe, just because, well, people don't really ask the salary question. I was lucky because, Ottoman history is filled with financial records. I would say, just looking at the kinds of records the Ottomans left, I would say these people just really care about money and not much more. And there are sayings like this about the Ottomans, Türk akçe sever, the Turks love their akçe, which is like a kind of currency, and things like that. And even today, I would say the salary is such an infatuation in Turkish culture, like how much salary are you making? And it's always the salary, right? It's not anything else. And I think maybe that's the legacy of the 17th century for us. That's why we are so worried about the salary, because, well, not a lot of people make a living salary in the 17th century and after, actually. Now, by comparison, someone like Cesare Cremonini, who is a professor of Aristotelian philosophy at the University of Padua, is making about 1,000 ducats. That's 2 kilograms of gold per year. 2 kilograms of gold per year gives you about $100,000 in today's money. So again, like, you see that, there is some, like, commensurability between, like, the money people made in the 17th century and the money people make today. Poor Isaac Newton, he is making 100 pounds, and 100 pounds is about 600 grams of gold or so. So he's making like 25,000 or so, which is kind of what you would make if you got a lectureship at Cambridge today. And he makes it work because he lives in a small Cambridge apartment. He doesn't have any children. He is either solitary or gay. We do not know, but that's kind of how it works out for Isaac Newton. Whereas, Galileo, who starts by making 1 kilogram of gold at the, when he gets his first appointment at Padua, like, spends his entire life, with side hustles and, like, trying to, like, make things work because he's got 3 children. Anyway, so the part of the point is, these people, like, people who would qualify as theoretical astronomers, physicists, anatomists, etc., these are so rare, even in European history, that I am fairly certain, having seen what I have seen, that you will almost always find a living wage behind anybody who is engaged in any of these theoretical enterprises. Somebody is paying them a living wage to pursue knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So that's kind of like, what explains the distribution of genres. And then it also puts a twist on, like, how, well, if this is what it is, if people are providing, goods and services, they're being perfectly useful. And this is, I would say, the main value of science in the 17th century Istanbul. It's nafi amel, or useful work, works conducive to common weal. So in that sense, it's perfectly Republican, right? So nobody is like, just to give you a sense, one of the most famous works of Galileo is Sidereus Nuncius. And there he's like, looking at the moon, and he's like, gifting the satellites of Jupiter, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I mean, when you think of it, what am I going to do with the satellites of Jupiter? You can do absolutely nothing with it. That's the kind of thing the Ottomans would not pay a penny for. Drug recipes, however, well, that's useful, right? So the utility is, it comes also at a register of utilitarianism and pragmatism that basically puts any pragmatic or utilitarian philosophy of the European kinds to shame. I mean, it's like Ottoman utilitarianism and pragmatism is just like so many, like it's so much more intense than you will find in many other places. And that's partly the reason, right? And well, how do these people end up making money after all? They go do business for themselves, they become entrepreneurs, they open up shops, they provide services. Again, it's kind of like us, they have a gig economy, as it were. And 17th century is when Ottoman society, or at least society in Istanbul, becomes a society of shopkeepers, or as we say in Turkish, esnaf, right? So everybody's an esnaf, and you can put a positive spin on this. So janissaries also become esnaf, well, because they're also going through the same thing. Janissaries are also not getting paid. Again, looking at flour prices, they are making about like $180 a month. And they're like, okay, I can't live on that kind of money, so I'll become a mafia guy, or like I'll open up a shop. I'll basically pick up some side gigs. And that's also why janissaries don't really want to fight in the 17th century. So there is this is the story of, well, I should say it in so many words. This becomes the story of decline, right? This is what Ottoman decline actually is. It's quite different from, well, basically the standard accounts of decline that have been categorically and rightly rejected by historians of the Ottoman Empire, right? It was like, well, people said, they are losing power, and they are not expanding anymore, et cetera, et cetera. This is, of course, a very human and quite militaristic way to look at Ottoman history. And, of all people, Cemal Kafadar especially has rejected this. This is not that, right? This is a very tender version of decline. It's quite different from anything that the Orientalists have said. And this is also what comes through in the literature. So you look at, pretty much everybody, in the 17th century, what are they saying? They are saying, well, professors are poor, you should pay them more. And this is, like, there is nobody who says otherwise, right? In the 17th century, people will say, you need to pay people more if you want them, like, not to take bribes or, like, take side gigs. If you want your soldiers to fight, you need to pay them more. And this is the story in the 17th century. And then, as a consequence, you have a transformation into a society where, like, you can't really, like, be a warrior for warfare's sake or be a scholar for scholarship's sake. You always need to do it for the sake of something else. And again, I think this is the future that we might be looking at right now. So what does that do? That also does a number on modernity, right? Because, well, if this kind of setup lies in our future and not necessarily in our past, well, that means, okay, introduce hyperinflation and you get modernity, in a manner of speaking. So everybody's an entrepreneur, very creative. So everything is new, by the way. And all of these people also claim, these are like, everything is jedid. So the almanacs are jedid. The recipes are jedid. Like, everything is new in this setting. So you have everything new, as in like all new 2020 Volkswagen Golf is all new. So you have this discourse of novelty and innovation that comes with this, because basically everybody's sort of enterprising. And what you don't have is, of course, like certain registers of scholarship that we, at university at least, would associate with serious innovation or theoretical innovation and things like that. So this is the situation that you find in Istanbul. Now, I think I have spoken for my 45 minutes. I will leave it at that, but I'll be happy to take any questions about the contents of the book, and if you want to discuss any of these points. Thank you.